So we've managed the cat issue. We're back on screen here.
Mm-hmm.
So just to re-summarize, about 1 in 5 Canadians at some point in their life will have a disability.
Mm-hmm.
That likelihood increases as they get older.
Yep.
They will have many other intersection challenges. If you're in a wheelchair, it's harder to get a job. It might be harder to go out dating. It might be harder to be social. So you were going to add some information that you found from your research?
So, again, with those different models, of people with disabilities as of 2016, they've actually broken it down into different types of disability. So, there are the conventional, like, continuous disabilities. So, like, if you think of someone who's disabled, there's someone that will be disabled for the prevalence of their entire life. So, someone that's born blind, someone who's born deaf. That accounts for 39% of the population, or 2.4 million. And 3.8 million, so over half, so 61%, is considered dynamic. And that just means that it changes over the lifetime.
Okay. So someone who maybe has MS and it can become progressive. Or,
so, yeah, exactly. So of those dynamics, there's progressive, so it worsens over the lifetime, like MS. There's recurrent, which is they'll have periods of a month or more where things get worse and then it can regress. And that accounts for 41% of that 61 or 30 or 3.8 million. And then the last one is fluctuating, and those are shorter periods, but they still experience limitations when they're not experiencing those problems. So basically, people with progressive limitations averaged about 4 different types of disabilities.
Okay.
So there's like that idea of comorbidity. So if you have one disability or one disorder, you're likely to have multiple others. And
Yes.
of these people, they were likely to have 4 documented disabilities. Fluctuating and continuous averaged about 3.
Okay.
And recurrent averaged about 2.
Okay.
Now, that being said, the employment rate was highest for the people with recurrent issues, and the lowest for people with progressive issues.
Interesting.
Of employed men, the percentage of men with recurrent issues was 93%, and with progressive issues, the lowest percentage of people that were employed men was 78%. In comparison to women,
Right.
Women that were employed that had documented disabilities, the greatest percentage had continuous disabilities,
Okay.
and they averaged a 79% employment rate.
Okay.
And the lowest employment rate for women had progressive disabilities, and they averaged 67% employment rates.
Okay. So for our work with social work with victims of abuse, noticing that with our client things change over time, and just because last time we saw them they were feeling extraordinarily in pain and depressed, let's say, don't assume that every time you see them they will have that same level of pain or that same challenge. It might be worse, it might be better. Make sure that you don't pin them into a space and keep them trapped there in your imagination. Mm-hmm. But what we also want to notice there is, let's say 1 in 5 Canadians have a disability or might have a disability. Mm-hmm. I've heard someone that I worked with who's a specialist in this area was talking about, in a way, we all will be using a prosthesis, which is glasses are a prosthesis, mm-hmm. right? If you think of it, there's all kinds of things and ways that people have some kind of physical challenge or limit, but with glasses or with medication or with a wheelchair or with a walker, they can be fully integrated into the world. So the problem is the world, not them. Yeah. Right? So we want to keep that open. What we also want to note is that predators will pick sexual abusers or wife abusers or sexual harassers in the workplace, will pick someone who's vulnerable and who can't fight back in the most fervent ways. So girls and women who have a limit or a challenge are very vulnerable to being abused. We want to make sure that we believe them when things happen. Many times in organizations or in the wider world, people will think, well, why would that handsome guy who has a beautiful wife and a great home and all these good things, he's a nurse. Why would he sexually abuse this girl who is blind and in a wheelchair or something? And sometimes the answer simply is because he can. He believes he can get away with it. So we can't assume that there's a belief out there. If you think of the Paul Bernardo story, some people will remember Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Mm-hmm. And here was this really handsome man who had a great job, who had a beautiful wife, who had a great car, who had everything going for him. And when they first were being researched as maybe serial killers, people said, well, he couldn't be a rapist and a killer. Look at him. He's, blonde hair, blue eyes, nice young man, nice job. He's married. He's got all these things going for him. Right. We have to remember to not stereotype our abusers. The abuser could be anyone. He could be a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, a coach, and we will think, well, he's a nice guy, right? Well, no, he could be using his power in a bad way behind the scenes. We also want to look at, each discipline will look at the story differently. Some of the cases, and I'll give a one that the last time I taught this course, or 2 times back, a group of students did a very profound presentation on a story that had been in the news. A woman who was, from my understanding or my memory, completely, her mind was lost to her. My memory, she'd been in a car accident and had a very serious head injury, and she was on life support systems in long-term care. She was completely in what some people would call a vegetative state, and the home was supposed to be taking care of her. Her family did not want to take her off life support because they didn't believe in that. So even though she wasn't fully aware, the family wanted to keep her alive for as long as possible because of their religious beliefs. At one point it became realized she was 6 months pregnant. And this was the big shock that was in the news. 1, she cannot give consent for sex. 2, the only people who had access to her were nurses, caregivers, doctors, the healthcare professionals in this care place. And 3, people asked the question, how did no one notice if they're giving her a bath every day and taking care of her the way they're supposed to? Wouldn't you have noticed that she was becoming fuller figured?
Yeah, and disproportionately large?
Right.
Like how
would you not notice that if you were there as a care professional who's supposed to be noticing her well-being? So this was an ugly story on a lot of fronts. Through DNA, they were able to affirm who it was who did it, and it was a nurse care worker, a male nurse care worker in the facility. And so it was one of those cases like the OJ case, those cases where it invited everybody in the community to discuss this and comment on it, and then to ponder what next, right? So one of the things, my memory was the baby was born, and the woman in the hospital, her parents adopted the baby and cared for the baby, and apparently the baby was born perfectly normal, healthy, fine. The nurse went to jail, but part of what he said at first was he had a relationship with her, which, is not how all of us would call a relationship. He basically had been sexually abusing her. He had been raping her because she can't give consent. Consent, if a person is not conscious, if they are asleep, if they are drunk, if they are stoned, and you have sex with them, you are committing a rape. You are invading somebody's body when they have not given you consent. The other question that came up with that particular case was, to what extent are we going to hold the organization and the other care professionals accountable? They are supposed to be protecting her and caring for her. And the abuse, we know if an abuser, if you are raped by someone who has control over you like that, every time he has a chance to do it, he's going to do it again. So it's unlikely that one time he did this, it's probable he'd been abusing her, having sex with her every time he had access to her room, which may have been every night, right? So it could have been 600 sexual assaults. Will he go to jail for the rest of his life? Probably not, the way the law is. So the other part I want to talk about, social work with victims of abuse, I want to draw your attention in that kind of story. You have a moral, ethical, and professional responsibility to be available to care for her family, to help with the baby, to help the organization clean up its act. It's not enough to just say, okay,
We're sorry.
we're sorry and the situation is stopped. Maybe there's other male predators, just like with the Catholic Church or the police departments or other coaches. We've heard stories where if things go on for a long time, it's likely there's more than one person involved in the story who either isn't stepping up and reporting, who's looking the other way, and or who is actively abusing. So our role in those kind of stories is to go further and to be an active advocate on behalf of that abused person. I want to go a completely different way now with this commentary on social work with victims of abuse and talk about disabilities. Sometimes there are stories where the parents, or the loving caregivers, the family members, the guardians, they have one of the 1,001 big lies inside them that people who have limits and challenges aren't entitled to the same sexual identity and joy and pleasure, orgasms, all that good stuff, right? The mother, let's say, I'll take an imaginary story of the mother says, my son has the mind of a child, so I never want him to have sex because he's always going to be a child. Even when his body is 42, he's still a child, so I don't want him to have sex. So this becomes a little bit complicated in terms of if a man with intellectual challenges falls in love with a woman with intellectual challenges and they want to be together, in terms of social work and us, yay. Yay. We are not entitled to take that freedom away from them. If someone has a lot of challenges and physical limits, and they want to talk to us about how do they masturbate, or how do they find their way to have a sexual life, or how can they date, or all those kinds of things, it can get a little bit awkward and weird because the parents, the guardians, the agency, we talked earlier about ageism. If a man, or a woman, but the story that I heard is of a man who lives in an elder care residence, and all his life he's been drinking and doing drugs, and all his life on payday he makes the choice to go to places where he can have sex with women and pay for it. Mm-hmm. Is it my right as the social worker in the elder's place to say, no, I'm going to control your paycheck, I'm going to control you, I'm going to forbid you to go out? He's an adult and he has rights for what he wants to do with his body. And if he wants to go out once a month on Friday and drink away his paycheck or spend his paycheck on drugs,
Gotta let him.
It's not my right to take that away from him. So this is where social work can get a little bit complicated. People want to, sometimes some family members want to take away the rights of people with intellectual or physical limits. We have to step up and advocate and say, in that kind of a story, the family member is being abusive in the sense of saying, well, my daughter is 32, but intellectually she's about 15, so I refuse to allow her to date, or I refuse to allow her to go out on her own to parties. We then are conceptualizing the parent as a type of an abuser. You're holding your daughter hostage. She wants to go out. Maybe she's going to make mistakes. Maybe she's going to get in trouble. Maybe she'll come home crying because some boy broke her heart. But these are part of the human condition again. Figuring out where's the exact line where individual, unique creativity and self-empowerment is being breached by a family member.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's so much more that could be said about disability, different abilities. I want to speak a little bit about mental health issues. And we know that girls and women and boys and men who have, let's say, schizophrenia, or they've been diagnosed with clinical depression, they've been diagnosed with borderline personality. A lot of these issues can get very messy in terms of people could be, they have a mental health challenge, and because of that, they turn to using drugs and alcohol. Because of that, they end up sometimes with people who are emotionally abusing them, or who are manipulating them, or exploiting them. And how do we step into those stories when there's concurrent disorders or multiple levels of challenge going on? So can you think of an example of that as I'm putting that out there?
I'm struggling.
Okay. Well, at a place like a women's shelter, you'll often find a woman who identifies herself as a sex trade worker. This is what she does. This is how she makes money. She does drugs. She does alcohol to manage her pain and her grief. And some people could conceptualize every one of her Johns is actually a rapist because she isn't really consenting, because she's consenting because she's addicted to drugs and she has a mental health issue, right? Like, again, this can get a little bit complicated in terms of each unique person in front of you figuring it out.
Well, that in correlation doesn't mean causation. You can't say that because their mental health issues, or because of their addiction that they're doing this, but also vice versa. Because they're a sex worker doesn't mean that they intrinsically are mentally unstable, or
right,
that that's caused their drinking. Like, it could be something else entirely.
You have to explore that with each unique person in front of you. Don't be imposing stereotypes or false beliefs or lies or assumptions. And also, what is your role as a social worker? If you put it in your mind that I'm going to save her, I'm going to rescue her, and she doesn't want to be rescued today, she only wants you to help her find her ID, or she wants you to help her find an apartment or something, and you've made up your mind, oh, she has a mental health issue, she is using drugs and alcohol, I'm going to save her, rescue her, rebuild her life, I'm going to be her white savior or something, you're probably going to get into a lot of trouble as a practitioner. It's not a good location to put yourself in because you don't have her consent to do these things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have an imagining that when someone has a mental health issue, we can just step all over them. It's almost like a free pass, right? She has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, therefore she's not free to make choices for herself.
She needs to be medicated.
She needs to be medicated, and ethically we can't make those choices for another person. Mm-hmm. This gets very painful and complicated because we may like, oh my God, I want to protect her. I worry about her.
That
right?
way you think that you know what's best. Like, that's a family thing.
Right.
Like, you can have a person, like, for example, I have a friend, and he has ADHD, and his family kept him medicated until he was 18, and then at 18 he was old enough to become his own medical advocate.
Yes.
And at 18 he decided that that was the end of it. He didn't want to be medicated anymore. Okay. And his parents were aggressively against it, but they couldn't stop it, and that was really upsetting for them because they thought that they knew what was best.
Right.
And for him, it was too much, and being medicated actually hindered his ability to think and do things.
Perfect example. So social work with victims of abuse, you could say that would be like emotional and psychological abuse that the parents are trying to inflict on their son. They may be coming from a place of love. They may sincerely believe they know what is best. But we in social work always cherish and value the autonomy of every person in front of us. So we may have the right to give them information about patterns, right? So I can say the pattern is with the young woman, let's say at a place like AWAC or Women Shall I Say, the part of why I worry about you, Samantha, is I know that research has shown that girls who are out there doing active sex trade work and who are using drugs and alcohol, the pattern is sooner or later some guy's going to beat you up, or sooner or later you're going to get hit by a car, or sooner or later someone's going to break your heart, or you'll catch a disease. So we're going to do that, share our information about the pattern, but we don't. If she says, I don't want to talk about that, I came to talk to you today to see if you could help me find an apartment. That's what she's consented to, and that's what we're going to focus on, right? So, I guess in summary on disabilities, there's so much more that can and should be said. I'll just summarize for the purposes of today's video. Every person, at some time in our life, we will be a disabled person for a moment or a day or an hour. The longer you live, the more likely you will be to have a disability through an injury or through simple aging. No matter what your disabilities or your limits, you are entitled to make choices for yourself, and every person will have a unique configuration of those limits and challenges. Our duty as a society is to try and set up structures and situations to empower people. How can I help you get a better wheelchair? How can I help you get a ramp? How can I help you get an elevator? And you deserve those opportunities and resources. We also want to note that the predators who do sexual abuse or workplace harassment or emotional abuse, or landlords who take advantage, etc., they are going to be drawn to those vulnerable people. So the more someone is vulnerable, the more we can be on alert that someone's going to take advantage, steal their paycheck, or take advantage of them in some other way. We also want to note that people with disabilities, people around them sometimes feel they have an extraordinary right to control their choices and opportunities. Like mom says, even though I'm 30, mom says I can't date. And our task might be to clarify to mom, your son or daughter has the right to do these things, even if it breaks everybody's heart, and even if we know the pattern is that a bad thing might happen to them in disproportion to fully able-bodied people. And we also want to know at all times the definition has to come from the person themselves. So they if she says, I'm not being abused by John, John is my boyfriend, even though we might think, well, that's abuse, we can inform her, we can educate her, we can help build her self-esteem and her courage and all these things. But if she says, I still love him and I want to live with him,
and I don't see this as abuse,
we as social workers can't go in there and save her. We can't take her hostage. There's a limit.
She has to want it.
She has to want it. That's the thing to know. And also to note, like that shocking story of the woman who was in the hospital, because some people would think that's unimaginable. She's in a coma. Who would rape her? Who would do that? Who would be so low? We want to know there are people out there who are that low. So once again, thank you for coming to our video on disabilities, different abilities, physical, mental, all those kinds of ways, and social work with victims of abuse. Thank you, Carlene, for collecting some statistics and research. Thank you again, Tuba, for being our Steven Spielberg.